Now I'd like to introduce Father Bryan Massingale, our 2020 Father Louis Trivison Award recipient. The Father Louis Trivison Award is given to a Roman Catholic who exhibits outstanding leadership in advancing FutureChurch Vatican II mission or vision in one or more areas of teaching, administration, research, publication, advocacy, and pastoral care. This year, we present that award to Father Massingale. Father Massingale is one of the world's leading Catholic social ethicists and scholars of African-American theological ethics, racial justice, and liberation theology. He joined the theology faculty at Fordham in the fall of 2016. Previously, he was on the faculty at Marquette University, where in 2009, he received the institution's highest award for excellence in teaching. He has served as president of the Catholic Theological Society of America and convener of the Black Catholic Theological Symposium. He holds 2 honorary doctorates. He has written over 80 articles, book chapters, book reviews for publications, including Theological Studies, New Theology Review, Journal of Society of Christian Ethics, Philosophy and Theology, Journal of Religion and Society, America Magazine, the National Catholic Reporter, and Catholic Peace Voice. His articles are primers in teaching white Catholics how to recognize our culpability for the ongoing blight of racism, white supremacy, and white privilege. Articles such as The Assumptions of White Privilege and What We Can Do About It. Amy Cooper knew exactly what she was doing. We all do, and that's the problem, in the National Catholic Reporter in June. And White Catholics Need to Sit with the Discomfort of Systemic Racism in America Magazine in June 2020. How the Church Can Combat Racism and White Privilege in America Magazine in February 2020. And the Church's Appalling Silence on Racism in U.S. Catholic in January 2017. There are so many more. These writings are the stuff of classics, drilling down into the heart of our collective complicity with white supremacy and prophetically calling us to live the gospel. His book, Racial Justice and the Catholic Church by Orbis in 2010 won the first place book award with the Catholic Press Association. It should be required reading for every Catholic in the United States. I first heard Father Massingale. We had a few first hearing Father Massingale stories in the previous session. I heard him at the Association of U.S. Catholic Priests Assembly in 2017. There he said, "Something catastrophic is happening in our country. And I don't mean only the morbid, wrenching, almost incessant killings of Black young men and boys, for these deaths reveal a deep malady at the core of America, a coldness, a callousness, a soul-warping disease. Racism is a soul sickness. It is a profound warping of the human spirit, one that enables human beings to create communities of cold, callous indifference to their darker brothers and sisters." I personally will never forget Father Massingale's prophetic words, his stirring manner, and the way the truth of his message stuck deep into our hearts. And then, as if on cue to be Exhibit A in a course on how white privilege works, during the Q&A, one person asked a particularly honest question, but sadly representative of the ultimate concerns of many white people. He asked, and this is paraphrasing, "What should we do? If I preach about what you have spoken about at my all-white parish, it will not go well. They will be angry and incensed, and they may even withhold their money." Now, I tell this story not to embarrass, but to recognize the priest's words indict us all, expose us all for the many ways our words and actions, large and small, explicit and implicit, coded and uncoded, enforce and reinforce white privilege and white supremacy. But that's why we're here tonight. That's why we sit like students of the Torah to learn at the feet of those who have a gospel truth to teach us. And that is why we are grateful that Father Massingale has joined us and accepted our Father Louis Trivison Award. Louis would be very proud. Please welcome our 2020 Father Louis Trivison Award recipient, Father Bryan Massingale.
Wow. Wow, thank you. First, before I move on, I apologize for the graininess of the video. It looks like I'm kind of beaming in from some extraterrestrial place. It's just, I've tried playing around the lighting in a New York apartment at night. It doesn't get any better than this. So this is how we're going to have to learn how to deal with life in this kind of COVID era. But thank you so much. It's an honor to be recognized. I thank FutureChurch for this award. It's an honor to be recognized, to be seen, and to be affirmed, especially in a church and by a faith community that regards people like me, and by that I mean Black, gay, relatively intelligent, and passionate about justice, that regards people like me as a danger, as a threat, as a contagion to be contained, as someone to be ignored when possible or attacked when not. So I thank you, FutureChurch, because as you may suspect, those who hold a different opinion of my ministry than you do are not shy about making themselves known. One day, in a future time, we can share and we can trade emails and horror stories about how people who have a different opinion of life than we do, how they make themselves known. So I am indeed very, very grateful for this honor and for this recognition. They've asked me to not just accept the award, but to say something about racial justice in the Catholic Church. And of course, I think I know a little bit about that. But let me do that by sharing with you a PowerPoint for my presentation. And what I've decided to do is to focus my remarks about racial justice in the Catholic Church by focusing them on the struggle against white nationalism. Because I think as we're looking at our current situation in America today, the challenge of white nationalism is a major threat to the integrity of the United States and indeed to the very existence of our democracy. And so let me approach the question by talking first about signs of hope. We gather at a time of duality. It's a strange time in which the times are very terrible, and yet there are also signs of hope. For example, we're still trying to absorb Pope Francis's affirmation of the humanity of sexual minorities by declaring that we have a right to a family. Now, note, I didn't say we have a right to civil unions. I mean, so many people are getting caught up in that term and whether this is a marriage and whether this is changing church teaching and sexual morality. I think that's an interesting debate, but it overlooks the fact that Francis grounds his support for civil unions for sexual minorities in the right to a family. And this is huge because in Catholic social thought, the right to a family is a fundamental human right. It's one of those basic guarantees that flows from our humanity, from our sacred human dignity as created in the image of God. As such, governments have a duty and obligation to secure and protect that right precisely because sexual minorities are human beings. Now, I know it sounds obvious, but all too often in church and society, there's a tendency to look at people like me as simply walking sex acts. And as I tell people, whether or not one agrees with sexual behaviors or expressions, we still have a fundamental humanity that needs to be affirmed. This is what I take away from the Pope's remarks that have been so celebrated and debated in the last few days. It shows that the church can change. Incrementally, slowly, tentatively, overly cautiously, but it can change. That's a sign of hope. Another sign of hope as we gather and we're still trying to absorb the impact of this news is that of the first African-American cardinal in the history of the U.S. Church, Cardinal Designate Wilton Gregory of Washington, D.C. This is a long overdue recognition, not only of Black presence and contribution in the church, but of Black leadership and excellence. And let me underscore excellence. Cardinal Designate Gregory has had a long history of leadership on many of the pressing issues facing the church, including racial justice, the scourge of sexual abuse, and the treatment of LGBTQ persons. Let's not forget that since newly coming to Washington, D.C., he told a trans Catholic that you belong in the church. And let us also not forget that he exercised prophetic leadership this summer in denouncing the ideological manipulation of our faith to serve partisan purposes and to enhance the president's image. This then is a moment of hope, not only for African-American Catholics, it's a moment of hope for the whole church, but it is particularly joyous to us, and I say us as a Black Catholic. For the first time, someone who not only looks like us, but also knows the pain of loving and serving a church which often does not love you back. That voice and perspective will be in the room when the next pope is chosen. That's something to rejoice in. That's a sign of hope. But hope is a very difficult word because we also have to admit that when we look around, we are living in very trying, terrible, and even, terrifying circumstances. To say a few words about racial justice in the Catholic Church, I have to speak forthrightly about the challenge to America of this hour and of our failure to address our deepest and longest social injustice that now imperils our very survival as a nation. I'm not being hyperbole, I'm not engaging in hyperbole when I say that. That insight about racial injustice endangering the survival of the nation was a prophetic intuition that was voiced in 1967 by Martin Luther King Jr. in a seldom studied address called The Three Evils of Society that he gave in August of 1967. And in that, he was discussing the rise and fall of past civilizations. And he notes that the rise and fall of these civilizations was not caused by external invasion, but by internal decay. They failed to respond creatively to the challenges impinging upon them. And then he concludes, if America does not respond creatively to the challenge to banish racism, some future historian will have to say that a great civilization died because it lacked the soul and commitment to make justice a reality for all. As many of us are approaching this election with trepidation and even wondering about the survival of democracy, we need to hear Martin Luther King's words for all of their prophetic depth. Trumpism, white nationalism, is a force that is imperiling the future of this nation. And Trumpism and white nationalism is driven by the lack of resolve, the lack of the soul and commitment to make justice a reality for all. This is the fundamental question, I think, that's facing our country this election season, is that will we be a country that strives for liberty and justice for all, or will we codify what we have been all too often in our history, a country where we grant liberty and justice only for some? That's the fundamental question that faces us. To understand what King is talking about, I want to talk now about white nationalism as one of the principal signs of the times that marks our American experience. In order to understand the rise of white nationalism, we have to understand it as a response to or reaction to the seismic shift in the country's social demographics, that we are becoming more racially and ethnically diverse than ever before recorded. The 2010 national census, our most recent one, already showed that over a third of the US population was, in the Census Bureau's words, Latino or non-white. That's their designation, not mine. And given how the groups of color are historically undercounted and widely admitted that they're undercounted, it was more likely that 40% of the country in 2010 was non-white. Moreover, the majority of children under the age of 12 belonged to racial and ethnic minority groups. Moreover, in 2014, the Census Bureau reported that for the first time in American history, there were more white American deaths than births in the United States. We estimate that by 2043, very soon, we will no longer have a majority race in the United States. In short, America is browning. But not only is America browning, the church is browning. The Catholic Church is also going through its own seismic demographic shift. In 2010, at a conference at Notre Dame University on cultural diversity in the church, the then apostolic nuncio stated that white Anglos are a minority of US Catholics. And then he declared, we don't have diversity in the church, we are a diverse church. Further evidence of this demographic shift comes when we look at the composition of newly ordained diocesan priests. That every year from 1999 to the present, between 20 to 30% of newly ordained diocesan priests are foreign born. And as this chart from Cara points out, that as the church gets younger, the church gets browner. Contrast the pre-Vatican II generation, where 76% of that generation, that cohort, is white or Caucasian, to those who are millennials born in 1982 or later, only 39% are white. As the church gets younger, the church gets browner. So the landscapes of both the nation and the church are being and already have been decisively altered. The future of both the country and the church is brown, not white. And there lies the problem. One of the signal events of our time is a deep anxiety over and discomfort with, and even opposition to this change in our population and our membership. Changing demography signals a changing national and ecclesial identity. To put it bluntly, we are no longer a white Christian nation, and many white Christian Americans are nervous, anxious, and angry. We've seen expression of this sentiment in the reaction of Bill O'Reilly, an influential political commentator. After President Obama was reelected in 2012 and the election was called, I switched over to Fox News to see how they were greeting this joyous news. And as you may expect, they had a different reaction than I did. I tuned in just in time to hear Bill O'Reilly lament, the demographics are changing. It's not a traditional America anymore. The white establishment is now a minority. This lament is important to understand and appreciate because white unease and resentment over the nation's changing demography and identity is the decisive reason for the rise of white nationalism. His views are a perfect illustration of what I call a sense of culture shock that has gripped many in our nation as they respond with confusion and anger over the changing American identity that's now occurring in their homeland. The demography of the country is changing, and endangered white status is leading more and more explicit calls to defend white supremacy, to fight against white extinction, or white privilege. And I apologize for some of the language on this slide here, but this is the way in which you see many of these people talking, where one man says, if I see one more Aryan man with a biracial child and his non-Aryan wife or girlfriend, I will physically throw their child over an effing bridge. These calls to defend white supremacy or white normative privilege were evidenced throughout the presidential campaign of 2016. The then Republican nominee held campaign rallies that were punctuated with racial insults and nativist demagoguery. At one point, racist attacks on people of color occurred at them, where people of color were forcibly ejected from his campaign rallies, or people who belonged to minority religious groups such as the Sikhs were targeted with stigmas, where Trump says, bye-bye, he wasn't wearing one of those hats, was he? He wasn't wearing one of those. Even the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, a fellow Republican and by no means a social liberal, accused Mr. Trump of engaging in what he called textbook racism. What we are seeing in the reaction of many Americans is a sense of culture shock, a sense of anxiety that one experiences when in an unfamiliar, foreign, or strange environment, where the social rules, customs, and expectations are different from what one expects or experiences as normal. When culture shock occurs in one's homeland, particularly for white Americans, in view of the major demographic shifts that are occurring, it is experienced as an existential threat. It undermines their self-identity and the foundations they believe that the country was built upon. That is, as a white Christian nation, a nation for white Christians. This is the context for understanding the horrific violence that happened at Charlottesville, when white nationalists marched carrying lit torches and shouting, "You will not replace us." Indeed, we now have a president who proudly and explicitly declares, "I'm a nationalist." And by this, he doesn't mean that he pursues policies that he judges to advance the nation's interests. Rather, he intends to advance the interests of those he considers real Americans, namely aggrieved whites, especially white men. White nationalism can be understood as a longing for a white utopia, for a place where white identity and comfort can be pursued independently of the desires and demands for non-white recognition. In short, it's a longing for a place where one can feel at home as a white person. Elizabeth Basco is a colleague of mine, a Catholic theologian, a white Catholic theologian. And in her book, Beyond Apathy, she talks about her experiences as being a missionary in Kenya. And she reflects upon a surprising feeling of homesickness, a homesickness that she described as wanting to return to the familiarity of a world defined by whiteness. Looking back on this experience from the vantage point of her further experience and study, she says she now realizes that her experience revealed something fundamental. Implicated in whiteness in America is a false sense of certainty or confidence about the way the world works and how it should look. We can see that more graphically by looking at T-shirts that are at the president's rallies. Look at these matching T-shirts here, where it says, "I would rather be Russian than Democrat." Think about that. What we see here is that many white Americans would rather live in a white authoritarian country than in a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy. Or to put it even more sharply, If democracy means sharing political power with people of color, and especially with Black Americans, then it's simply not worth it. I put all this before you because I think we need to put the kind of the conversations and debates that we're having in this country in the context of white nationalism. Why is it that democracy is imperiled? Why is it that we're engaging in efforts of voter suppression? Why is it that these are things that can happen in plain daylight? Because all too often, and all too many people, they made the conclusion that democracy means sharing political power with people of color, then it's not worth it. A white authoritarian country is more preferable than a multiracial democracy. There are many ways to define white nationalism. My definition is here. White nationalism is the visceral, non-rational, instinctual conviction that this country, its public spaces, its institutions, its cultural heritage, that belongs to white people in a way that it does not and should not belong to others. It's the conviction that America is fundamentally a white Christian nation. Note that white nationalism isn't always or even principally about hate. Acts of hatred come as a consequence of a threat to white identity can't be resolved in other ways, but at its core, white nationalism is more about belonging. Whose country is this? Who belongs here? Who's really American? These are the key nationalist concerns and questions. This is the reason also, parenthetically, why many Americans aren't upset about the fact that we have 545 children who cannot be reunited with their parents. Because in the white nationalist mind, they don't belong here anyway. They're beyond or outside of our moral concern. As a consequence, in a society plagued by rising white nationalism, people of color, and especially Black people, are present in public spaces only because of either white permission or toleration, that is in limited numbers to meet the requirements of decency or affirmative action, or they're present by non-white fraud or deceit, that is by illegal immigrants who quote unquote infest our country, or the undeserving beneficiaries of affirmative action, or they're somehow faked a birth certificate so that they function as an illegitimate president. If people of color are present in white spaces and public spaces only by permission or toleration, note that that permission or toleration can be revoked when white discomfort is triggered. And then people of color can be removed from public spaces by any means necessary. So example, family separation and deportation policies, calling the police on Black people when they're sleeping in college dorms, picnicking in public parks, waiting for friends in Starbucks, or even sleeping at home after saving lives as an EMT in Louisville, Kentucky. All of this is to say that underneath all of the headlines, I think there's a tendency in this country to see these headlines as isolated incidents. What I'm trying to do is to show the thread that unites all of them. There's an underlying movement that unites all of them, and it poisons and threatens the very nature, survival of our democracy. Now, I also want to point out that white nationalism is not just out there in our country. White nationalism also affects our church. You knew I was going to have to make that move. There is a deep Catholic ambivalence. We raise the questions such as, whose church is this? Whose community is this? And we see this evidenced in comments such as ones I've heard at after a diocesan ordination, where the majority of the ordinands were men of color, one of the priests was lamenting, when are we going to get some of our candidates? And I'm like, well, what, aren't they ours? I mean, they're ordained for service to this diocese. Or at a workshop I was giving when a white male provincial made the observation that in his community, we have too many Juans and Jose's and not enough Jims and Johns. Or from another white provincial during the same workshop who said, you know, we're a German province. We love being a German province. We're proud to be a German province. So how can we attract Black men to our order? To which I said, well, I guess you got to find some Black German speaking guys. I don't know. But see, or another question that I'm asked at workshops and presentations that Deborah alluded to earlier, how can we talk about race in my community or in my church without making white people uncomfortable? Note that behind all of these questions is the deeper unstated question, whose community is this? Who really belongs? Who counts as one of us? Before we move on, let's think about this question of comfort, about making sure we talk about race in a way that doesn't make white people uncomfortable. Why is it that the only group that's never supposed to be uncomfortable in racial discussions are white people? Why is the comfort of whites the controlling factor in racial conversations? Not only does this discount or ignore the discomfort and threat that people of color experience in white spaces, but it also means that we can only discuss our experiences in ways that are tailored and edited for white comfort. It also means that the church and society are never get to facing the very difficult truths that need to be faced if we're ever to move beyond the racial quagmire that we find ourselves in. The plain yet terrible truth is that the Catholic Church is constituted by a normative whiteness. It can be illustrated by the events that surrounded the papal mass presided over by Pope Benedict during his visit to the United States in Washington, D.C. in 2008. The readings for that mass were celebrating the rich cultural diversity of the Church in the United States, including the reading from the classic account of the Acts of the Apostles, where the Holy Spirit descended upon the gathered community representing the world's peoples. Now everyone heard the gospel proclaimed in their own language. The offertory gifts were brought forward, accompanied by vigorous gospel and Spanish singing. At the end of the offertory procession, the commentator on EWTN said, quote, "We've just been subjected to an over-preening display of multicultural chatter. And now the Holy Father will begin the sacred part of the Mass." Note the disjunction, the opposition between sacred and multicultural. God can only speak or be revealed in European idiom. All of this reflects and strengthens a conclusion I reached in my earlier work, probably the most quoted sentence from my book, Racial Justice in the Catholic Church. What makes the church white and racist is the pervasive belief that European aesthetics, music, theology, and persons, and only these, are standard, normative, universal, and truly Catholic. This is what I mean by saying there's a normative whiteness that constitutes American Catholicism. The challenge facing American Catholicism in this time of rising white nationalism was prophetically described by the noted Black Catholic historian, Benedictine priest Cyprian Davis. In a 2004 lecture, he stated, "In another decade or so, US Catholics will learn that our church is more Black, brown, and in between than Caucasian, and more Catholic with a small c than they dreamed. Will we be prepared for what that will mean?" The answer simply is no. And don't take my word for it. Hear the responses of a racially mixed group of Catholics that they gave at a parish workshop when I asked them to describe in one word the church's engagement with issues of race. Irrelevant, tribalism, indifferent, complicit, lost, blind, dying, archaic, cemetery. The hat you see there was a PR campaign that the Archdiocese of New York was considering. They're considering a slogan for a parish renewal campaign. And one of their consultants came up with the idea that since most Catholics are familiar with the red cap, why don't we have the parish renewal campaign being "Make Arch New York Great Again"? And they came to the priest meeting with these hats all made up as mocks that could be as marked demonstrations that could be given out to people, to Catholics throughout the Archdiocese. There was one Latino priest and one Black priest on the priest council at the point, and they tried to say, "Don't you see there's a problem here?" To which reportedly the response was, "What's the problem? Our people understand what that means." We can also put tone deaf as well. Nationalism, whether in church or society, is not always or principally about hate. It's about longing for a white utopia by aggressively asserting belonging and dominance out of a sense of anxiety over rapid social change. It can be carried by white supremacists carrying torches, or it can be carried by people simply avoiding the issue out of silence or presenting it in ways that only cater to the comfort of whites. But this longing for utopia, a white utopia, is a delusion. In the words of the African-American novelist, intellectual, James Baldwin, he said that this world is white no longer and will never be white again. I often say that in the United States, sometimes I wonder if we're not suffering from a collective delusion, a collective sense of delusion. All this sounds very grim. So I'm going to return to where I began, to hope, and to love. But I want to ground these understandings of hope and love in those that are informed by the Black experience. In the Black experience, hope is not a rosy sense of optimism. Rather, hope is found in the midst of conflict and struggle. In fact, conflict and struggle are the signs of hope. They're the means by which change and transformation happen. We see this in Martin Luther King's observation that privileged groups seldom surrender their privileges voluntarily. If privileged groups don't surrender their privileges voluntarily, then social conflict and struggle is indeed a sign of hope. It means that privilege, unjust privilege, is being challenged. King is simply voicing an insight that Frederick Douglass, the noted abolitionist, said over a century before he did. He wrote in classic words, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom, yet deprecate agitation, are men and women who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. Now, this struggle may be physical, it may be moral, it may be both moral and physical, but there must be struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Conflict and struggle then are not surprising, unusual, or unexpected. Rather, the fact of conflict and struggle, both in the church and in the country, these are signs of hope. Because whenever we see conflict and struggle within the church, it means that the status quo is being challenged and is endangered. Conflict and struggle herald the possibility of something new, something more just, something more Christ-like, a church more universal, more welcoming and inclusive. In a strange way, the more conflict there is, the more hope there actually may be. The other thing I want to point out is that in the African American experience, hope is also transgenerational. Hope is not about what's in it for me. It's about what will happen someday because of me. I often say hope is like a relay race. And when we run a relay race, it's not up to me to be the one that breaks the tape or crosses the finish line. When I'm running a relay race, I run the best race I can for the sake of those who come after me and to honor my teammates who ran before me. It's not up to me to see the end, to see the goal. It's up to me to run the race that's given to me. Hope is transgenerational. We're part of a justice relay team. Let me make this more personal. My ancestors did not know that one day I would be. And my ancestors certainly didn't know that tonight you'd be giving me an award for my ministry. But here I am, doing what I'm able to do now because of who they were and what they dared to do. In the Black Catholic experience, there were pioneers such as Sister Antona Ebo, who was one of the nuns who marched with Martin Luther King in Selma, Alabama. And Sister Thea Bowman, the noted orator who taught bishops and led the liturgical renewal of Black Catholic worship in the church. Father Al McKnight, who is a prophetic figure who died in the last 2 years, and Dr. Wyatt Turner, the head of the Federation of Colored Catholics, one of the first lay-led groups in the Catholic Church, even before Vatican II in the 1920s, advocating for an independent lay voice. None of these figures knew that Wilton Gregory, Cardinal Wilton Gregory, would one day be. But he is, because of who they were and what they did. Hope, then, is not a matter of what's for me or will I see it. Hope is about what will be because of who we are now and what we dare to do now. The best way to predict the future is by working now to help create it. Now contains the hope of the future. It won't just come. It arrives now because of who we are now and what we dare to do now. And that hope for a future is based in love. For all revolutions are rooted in love. A love of self as a beloved creation of God. A love that fights for a world where all are loved. Loved in spirit and in truth, and not just in rhetoric. This summer, in the midst of the Black Lives Matter protests, someone turned to me and asked me to write something for a blog of theirs. And this was after writing so many of the essays that Deb pointed out earlier. And I was just exhausted. I don't even know what to say. But then I took a moment of quiet and something came to me. And it was surprising. And I submitted this to the authors of the Political Theology blog, not knowing they'd publish it, but it was what I really wanted, what I really believed. And I wrote, in the midst of crushing grief and numbing pain, of outraged curses and existential fatigue, in the midst of it all, in moments of stillness, I find my thoughts turning to love. Black love, Black radical love, love of, for, and by Black people. Because eliminating the scourge of anti-Blackness, creating that freedom dream where Black lives matter will not come about because of police body cameras, blacked out Instagram squares, marches and chants, tweeting and mobilizing, or even defunding the police. We need all that and more, far more. Anti-Blackness is a spiritual malady, a soul sickness, an interior malformation of a magnitude for which we lack words. An affliction that can only be healed when we learn how to love Blackness, Black bodies, Black people. Not in a sentimental sense, not in a corporate neoliberal Benetton hallmark, there's only one race, I don't see color deep down, we're all the same superficiality. But rather with the profundity of Toni Morrison's exhortation in her novel Beloved, where she says, love your flesh. Yonder out there, they don't love your flesh, so you must love your flesh. With the courage of James Baldwin's injunction in his novel, Just Above My Head, where he tells us to accept your nakedness as sacred and hold sacred the nakedness of another. For it is only when we learn how to love Blackness that we can heal this terrible soul sickness at the heart of this country and at the heart of this church. And only then can we make of this old world a new world, a world where Black lives matter, a world where Black lives are sacred, where Black lives can breathe free. I thank you again for your award and for your recognition. Let the church say, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Bryan, for those discomforting, challenging, and inspiring words. I, in this moment, can't describe what they mean to me, and I think mean to all of us who have gathered here tonight. So thank you. I am going to open this time now for question and answer. Just so that you all know, we are recording this and we will be posting this publicly thanks to the generosity of our sponsors and partners, after the event has finished. So if you would rather not appear on camera, I'd invite you not to ask a question. But otherwise, you can indicate your interest in asking a question of Father Massingale by either raising your hand if you know how to do that, or by muting yourself, unmuting yourself if you'd like to do that as well. And your unmute button is down in the left-hand corner. I see that Lizzie Byrne DeGear has a question. Oh, Lizzie, I think you're muted right now.
I think, Lizzie, you have to unmute yourself.
I think we're having maybe some technical difficulty with Lizzie. I'm going to go to Maura Egan and see what Maura's question is.
Oh, good evening, and I'm so delighted to get to hear Father Massingale again. And I wanted to thank you for such a hopeful message and also a challenging message. I think that's what we need these days, is both hope and challenge. And I wondered, I think in one of your slides you were talking about how as the ordained clergy gets younger, as a body, they become more diverse.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously not diverse in gender, and not, I don't think, diverse in ability, as we still have very few ordained clergy or members of religious communities with disabilities. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that kind of diversity, and how the kinds of diversity you're observing, or that you hope to further observe, how would that kind of shape the way liturgy is, or the way church would be, beyond just sort of, the presence of people of different identities at the altar? Like, how would things be different because of that diversity?
Thank you, Maura. That's a very good question. Unfortunately, there's no easy answer to that, because while the church is getting more ethnically diverse, we're not seeing what I would call native or homegrown diversity. In other words, the ethnic diversity is present in the priesthood is because of those who are born outside of the United States being ordained to serve in the United States. We have very few, for example, native US Hispanic vocations, and very few African American vocations. We have a lot of African vocations, but a lot of African American vocations. Now, there are this complicates the picture immensely, because first of all, people who have progressive ideas or ideas that are outside the mainstream don't find it easy to survive the seminary system as it currently exists. So part of the ability to become a good priest is that you have to be a good seminarian, or at least a camouflage seminarian, and not draw attention to yourself. That's just the reality. The other thing is that people sometimes, when they come from outside the country, they bring ideas about, for example, gender and roles of women in the church, which are at variance with the ways in which the American culture thinks about gender and the role of women. And so just because it's becoming more ethnically diverse doesn't mean that there's necessarily going to be a greater kind of sensitivity when it comes to issues of gender. So it's a mixed bag. This is the optimistic part of me that hopes that with the complexion of the priesthood changes, regardless of whether that complexion is homegrown or not, that will open the door for an openness for other kinds of diversity, such as from African Americans or US-born Latinos. But I have to say that it's not always going to be easy, and it's not always to be hopeful. I know a number of you are raising the question of gender inclusion in the priesthood, and that is certainly a neuralgic issue that I do not expect to be resolved in my lifetime. But then again, I've seen things in my lifetime I thought I would never see, so I'm not a prophet. Prophets don't predict the future. Prophets keep working for God's future. That's our job.
Thanks, Brian. So Lizzie was able to text me her question, so I'm just going to go ahead and read that right now.
Okay.
She says, first of all, deep gratitude. It seems that education, or a lack thereof, underlies much of the MAGA white supremacist movement. Is there a movement in Catholic schools to provide anti-racist education? And has that movement been embraced?
Okay, the short answer is no. The longer answer would be that one of the demands of the Black Lives Matter movement has been to call attention to the silences and omissions that are present in our curricula. So I think you see in Catholic colleges and universities a greater attention to these issues. You see in Catholic high schools, I've seen a number of their diversity and inclusion plans where they're calling for greater attention to issues of race and diversity in their curricula. So I think you're seeing only the beginnings of a rhetorical commitment to these kinds of issues. The major problem becomes not simply in the words, the problem comes in the funding. Because as a Catholic church, we're very good about having great statements. The problem becomes, when do we actually fund these initiatives? And as I often tell people, budgets reveal what you find truly of value and priority. That time and money equal priority and commitment. And so until we see a greater funding taking place of these kinds of curricular initiatives, I'm going to be kind of skeptical or holding my breath. Where we have not made a lot of progress yet is in the Catholic grade schools. There's been a great attention since the Black Lives Matter movement to asking for Black Catholic history, among other subjects, to be taught in Catholic grade schools. So far, it's been a rhetorical call that's been given. I haven't seen a whole lot of efforts to really institutionalize that in Catholic education. We also say that it's not happening in seminaries either. I have been appalled and scandalized at some of the sermons I've seen on YouTube of Catholic priests preaching on Black Lives Matter, calling it an anarchist group, a group infiltrated by Marxists, saying it's against the nuclear family, and therefore Catholics can have no part with the Black Lives Matter movement. You can see these all over YouTube, and unfortunately, it's because Catholic priests are speaking out of ignorance or malice. Stop there. Thank you.
Okay.
Excuse me.
Yeah, sure. We'll take your time getting a drink or whatever you need to do. And I'm going to go, if that's all right with you, Brian, I'll go with 2 more questions. Does that work for you? Okay. All right. So I'm going to, let's go with Julie. Julie, I see you're on an iPad, but I know that's not your last name.
Thank you. Many of the questions addressed aspects of elitism, and I'm certainly have a bias of growing up in a culture of sameness, whether it be economic or academic. And I guess my question is more of a request if Father Massingale would like to continue commentary on elitism, whether it be academic, economic, or otherwise in the hierarchy of the church.
Elitism. One of the things I'm curious about is it's not elitism, as I would say, a certain closedness or sameness that afflicts the hierarchy. 2 years ago, I believe it was, the Pew Research Center did a survey of the bishops of the United States. And what they found out that the typical bishop in the United States is well, they're all white, they're overwhelmingly white men over the age of 65, who almost the majority of them get their news sources from Fox News or EWTN or the National Catholic Register. Now, that's not elitism, but it does speak to a certain monochromatic kind of uniformity where there's a lack of outside perspectives that are present in the hierarchy. That frankly, the Catholic hierarchy resembles the typical profile of the typical Trump supporter. White men over the age of 65 who get their news from a very restricted source. That has to have a very telling effect in terms of their understanding of the human condition, understanding the country, and understanding the church. From those statistics, it's pretty clear that the composition of the hierarchy does not at all reflect the demography of the Catholic Church. And when you don't have voices at the table, then there's going to be a certain level of groupthink that almost has to take over. And it becomes a reinforcing echo chamber that's harder and harder to pierce. It's not quite elitism, but it's getting at the same dynamic that you're talking about. The dangers of elitism are the dangers of any kind of closed group, especially when the voices of the marginal and the outcast are not only not present, but are unwelcome. Then you're going to have the dangers of inadequate, misguided approaches to pastoral ministry and to church teaching. So thank you.
And Deb has our final question.
So mine's two-part, Brian. I've heard you draw a very clear line between the US bishops and many Catholics sort of one issue voting, abortion, and racism. And so I'd like you to talk a little bit about that, because I think you made it clear for me in a way that it wasn't as clear before, what's underneath all that. The other question I have is we do a lot of work around, it's called Save Our Parish Communities. Chris Schenk started it a long time ago. So working with Catholics who want to keep their parishes open. What part has racism played in closing Black Catholic churches across the United States? You know, if you go to CARA, their standard answer is, oh, well, everybody's moving to the South, you know, blah, blah, blah. And no one has done a study that I can find of what's going on in terms of racism and the closing of Catholic churches.
Let's take your second question. You're right that no one's done that study. And I think part of the reason no one's done the study is that no one wants the answer. No one wants the answer to the question. To draw another line, people ask me the question, well, how many gay priests are there? And I said, well, we don't know. And we don't know because we don't want to know. We don't ask the question. So yes, I mean, people often say that it's due to the fact of changing mobility in terms of the white Catholics who established the church have moved out, Blacks, African Americans moved into the neighborhood, African Americans aren't Catholic in the same numbers, so the Catholic population declines, and there differs in economic base to keep the parish going, therefore the parish has to close. That's the typical answer that's given. What that answer neglects is the fact of why wasn't there an outreach to the African American population, an active effort of evangelization and welcome into the church? So, for example, the common line of thought is that, well, African Americans are all Baptists or Protestants. Well, that's not true. We know, for example, that the African American population, 20 to 25% don't have a church home. That means that there are millions of African Americans who could be welcomed into the Catholic Church if the Catholic Church wanted to have a conscious program of evangelization and therefore, save the parish. And we know historically that one of the major reasons why we don't have an active effort to welcome African Americans in the church is because we don't want to welcome African Americans into the church. That's just historical fact. And that's one of the ways that racism can play into the closing of African American parishes. To your question about abortion, there are two ways in which the church's single issue or single-minded fixation on abortion feeds into racism and racial dynamics. One is that in calling abortion the preeminent moral issue, the word preeminent becomes an excuse for dismissing every other social concern. And so basically it's to say that the only concern that really counts, and that we give rhetorical lip service to all these other, like climate change and racism, et cetera. However, the preeminent issue is abortion. What that means, therefore, is all these other ones can in practice be ignored. And that's the way in which that teaching is in fact being received in this election year. And so by calling abortion a preeminent issue, you're basically dismissing concern for Black Lives Matter. Now, you're not doing it rhetorically. You say, of course, that issue is important, but the preeminent one is this. The other way in which abortion factors into the church's advocacy or non-presence with racism is this. In the 2016 election, many white Catholics said that they voted for President Trump because of his pro-life stance, in other words, a stance against abortion. However, major social studies since then have pointed out that that's not the case. That may be the espoused reason, but when you dig deeper, what they found for white Catholics, the president's stance on immigration issues and perceived stance on racism was the more driving factor motivating their support for the president, not his stance on pro-life issues. And I don't want to say that there were no white Catholics who did not have a sincere concern about abortion, but I'm simply saying that the research does not bear that out for the majority of white Catholics who supported the president in 2016. So those are two of the ways in which the church's fixation on the abortion issue, and I say fixation because single issue voting has never been a requirement of the Catholic faith. When you look at Pope John Paul II, Saint Pope John Paul II, when he came to the United States in 1999, he explicitly declared that racism was a life issue. We see Pope Francis talking about racism as a life issue. We see Pope Francis saying that you cannot turn a blind eye to racism and claim to be protecting the dignity of all human life. Even Pope Benedict in his writings said that one can vote for a politician who may not be totally what the church would want on life issues if there are other issues that on balance would lead to support for that person, for that candidate. In other words, In no other church that I'm aware of, national church that I'm aware of, do we find this single-minded fixation on abortion as being the litmus test for political discernment. It's only in the United States, frankly, that I'm aware of. And so I think that we need to challenge that focus for a number of reasons, but not the least of them is that it is practically used in the church as a way to evade the call to racial justice by saying that, of course, we're concerned about it, but the preeminent issue is abortion. And therefore, anything else a candidate may stand for simply gets a pass. So this person we can call Black Lives Matter protesters who are exercising their First Amendment rights, Marxist thugs. He can cage children and separate them from their. This is the thing I don't understand. Separating children from your parents. When I was 16 years old, I worked in a department store. And we had a protocol of what to do when there was a lost child in the store. There was a special announcement that was made over the PA system, and everyone stopped everything they did, and everyone scoured the store to look for the lost child. And I remember seeing over and over again the tears of relief and joy when mother and father and child were reunited together. And that was when the child was only separated or lost for 5 or 10 or maybe 15 minutes at most. How we can have people in this country who can support someone who would advocate for a policy where children as young as 2 or 3 months are taken away and separated from their parents and not even care about trying to see if we can reunite them again, and yet say that that candidate is a pro-life candidate. I have to be honest, I find that just not only incomprehensible, I find it despicable. I find it morally reprehensible. And I just need to be upfront about that, that if white parents would shed tears of joy and relief over being separated from reunited with their kids after only a 5-minute separation, then there is no way we can give support to someone in the name of life who would separate children from their parents for thousands of miles and then have the audacity to say, well, at least they're being taken care of, they're in good hotels. That's not pro-life.